Nobody, not even the producers who had spent almost an entire year preparing the event, expected the biggest crisis of the evening to happen 15 minutes before millions of Americans tuned in. The newspapers would later describe it as the most unforgettable backstage moment in Hollywood history. Some believed it had been an argument. Others called it a battle of egos. Many claimed they knew exactly what had happened. Almost none of them did, because the cameras captured the stage. They never captured the silence behind the curtain, and that silence changed lives forever. Hollywood, California. A warm summer evening. Searchlights swept across the night sky. Limousines stretched for blocks outside one of the largest television studios in America. Crowds stood behind metal barricades. Fans held homemade signs. Photographers shouted the names of movie stars as they stepped onto the red carpet. Inside, the atmosphere felt electric. This wasn't just another television program. It was the biggest charity broadcast of the decade. Every dollar raised would help children's hospitals across the country. Millions of Americans were already gathering around television sets in living rooms, restaurants, hotels, and military bases. Entire families planned their evening around one event, the grand finale. Backstage, more than 100 performers hurried through narrow hallways. Wardrobe assistants carried sparkling costumes. Makeup artists made last-minute adjustments. Stagehands rolled enormous set pieces toward the main stage. The orchestra rehearsed the final arrangement one last time. Every second mattered. Every cue had been timed perfectly. One mistake would be seen by millions. Inside the largest dressing room, some of the greatest entertainers in America quietly prepared together. Frank Sinatra adjusted his tuxedo in front of a mirror. Dean Martin relaxed in a chair, gently humming the melody of the finale. Sammy Davis Jr. joked with members of the orchestra, making everyone nearby laugh despite the pressure. Across the room, Elvis Presley stood alone near a garment rack. He carefully buttoned the sleeves of his famous black stage suit. The rhinestones caught the warm dressing room lights, sparkling with every movement. He looked calm, far calmer than anyone else. One young stage assistant nervously approached him. "Mr. Presley, the audience is already filling the studio." Elvis smiled warmly. "That's a good sign." The assistant laughed. "I've never seen this many celebrities in one place." Elvis adjusted his cufflinks. "Tonight isn't about celebrities. It's about the people watching at home." The assistant nodded. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Dean Martin overheard the conversation. He walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Elvis accepted one with a smile. "Thank you." Dean looked around the crowded dressing room. "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" "We've sung in front of kings, presidents, packed arenas, but somehow, a live television audience still makes everyone nervous." Elvis laughed softly. "It should. If you stop respecting the audience, you stop deserving them." Dean raised his coffee cup. "To another unforgettable night." Elvis gently tapped his cup against Dean's. "To the audience." Outside, the production control room buzzed with activity. Directors counted camera positions. Assistant producers checked the running order. A giant digital clock displayed the remaining time. 15 minutes until live broadcast. The executive producer looked over the schedule one final time. Everything was perfect. The opening acts had gone smoothly during rehearsal. The orchestra was ready. The lighting cues were locked. The finale, featuring Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and several younger stars, would almost certainly become one of the greatest television performances ever broadcast. At least, that was the plan. Down the hallway, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against polished floors. A dressing room door flew open. A young superstar singer stormed inside. She still wore her glittering stage costume. Her makeup was flawless. Her expression was not. Without saying hello, she threw her performance script onto the floor. Pages scattered across the room. Conversations stopped instantly. Frank Sinatra slowly lowered his reading glasses. Sammy Davis Jr. looked up from the piano. Dean Martin quietly set his coffee on the table. Elvis simply turned around. The young singer pointed directly at him. Her voice echoed through the dressing room. "I'm not sharing a stage with him." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the orchestra rehearsing somewhere beyond the hallway seemed to disappear. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One makeup artist accidentally dropped a powder brush onto the floor. No one picked it up. The young singer wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to attract attention. She meant every word. The executive producer hurried into the room. "There has to be some misunderstanding." "There isn't." She folded her arms. "I won't perform beside Elvis Presley." The producer stared in disbelief. "We're live in 15 minutes. "I don't care. You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious." She looked directly at Elvis again, then spoke the words that made the room even colder. "He's yesterday's headline. If I stand beside Elvis, people will only remember him." Several assistants quietly looked toward the floor. One stage manager closed his eyes. Nobody knew what to say. The producer desperately tried again. "Please, think about what you're saying. Millions of people are waiting." She didn't hesitate. "Then change the finale." Every eye in the room slowly turned toward Elvis Presley. Some expected anger. Others expected humiliation. A few feared the beginning of a public argument that would destroy the evening before it even began. Dean Martin watched silently from the corner. Frank Sinatra remained perfectly still. Sammy Davis Jr. crossed his arms. Nobody interrupted. They all waited. Elvis looked down at the folded performance schedule resting on the dressing room table. He picked it up, read it quietly one last time. Then, he folded it carefully, placed it back exactly where he had found it, looked at the young singer, smiled kindly, and said only one sentence: "If she doesn't want to sing with me, don't force her." The room froze. No anger, no insult, no attempt to defend himself. Elvis reached for his jacket, quietly slipped it over his shoulders, then turned toward the dressing room door. Ready to leave the building without another word, no one realized that before the night was over, a different legend would step forward and speak 7 words that every person in that studio would remember for the rest of their lives. The dressing room door slowly opened. Elvis reached for the handle. For one brief moment, it looked as though the biggest star in America was about to quietly disappear. Not because he had been defeated, not because he had been humiliated, but because he refused to become part of an argument. No one tried to stop him, not immediately. The producers were too stunned. The stage managers stood frozen. Even the makeup artists remained perfectly still. The only sound was the ticking of the large production clock mounted on the hallway wall. 14 minutes until live broadcast. The executive producer finally found his voice. "Mr. Presley, please wait." Elvis turned politely. "If she doesn't want to perform, she shouldn't have to." "But the finale." "The audience deserves honesty. They don't deserve someone standing beside me against their will." The producer rubbed both hands across his face. "You don't understand. If this finale falls apart, it could destroy the entire broadcast." Elvis smiled gently. "No. It'll only destroy a television show. Don't let it destroy people too." The room fell silent again. Frank Sinatra slowly removed the cigarette from his hand. He looked toward Dean Martin. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. After decades together, a single glance was enough. Sammy Davis Jr. quietly leaned against the piano, watching, listening, waiting. The young singer folded her arms, still convinced she had won. She believed Elvis would eventually argue, or demand respect, or insist that producers remove her instead. He did none of those things. That confused her more than anything. Elvis quietly picked up his guitar case. One of the youngest stage assistants rushed toward him. His voice trembled. "Mr. Presley!" "I've dreamed my whole life of seeing tonight's finale." Elvis placed one hand on the young man's shoulder. "You still will." The assistant looked confused. "Without you," Elvis smiled. "The show has never been about one person. It's always been about the people watching." Just as Elvis reached the hallway, another voice echoed through the dressing room. "Hold on there, kid." Elvis stopped walking. He recognized that voice immediately. Dean Martin. Dean slowly stood from his chair, smoothed the front of his tuxedo, finished the last sip of his coffee, then quietly placed the empty cup on the dressing table. Every person in the room watched him. Several producers expected an explosion. Dean had defended his friends before. He was famous for speaking his mind. Some feared he was about to end the evening with one angry sentence. Instead, he calmly walked across the room, past Elvis, past Frank Sinatra, past Sammy Davis Jr., until he stood directly in front of the young singer. He looked her in the eyes. Not with anger, not with disappointment, almost with sadness. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The silence itself became uncomfortable. Finally, Dean spoke. Only 7 words. "Legends never fear standing beside other legends." Nothing else. No lecture, no shouting, no insults. Just 7 quiet words. The room changed instantly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was something much deeper. The young singer's confident smile slowly disappeared. Her shoulders stiffened. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain, because she suddenly realized nobody in the room was looking at Elvis anymore. They were looking at her, not with admiration, not with respect, with disappointment. One veteran lighting technician quietly lowered his eyes. A wardrobe assistant looked away. Even the musicians stopped pretending to organize their instruments. Dean hadn't embarrassed her. He had simply allowed everyone to see the truth for themselves. Dean gently turned toward Elvis, placed one hand on his shoulder, smiled. "Come on, kid. Let's go make history." Elvis chuckled softly. "I thought history was already written." Dean grinned. "Only by people who quit too early." Frank Sinatra suddenly stood. He straightened his famous tuxedo, looked toward Elvis. "You boys leaving without me?" Laughter quietly spread through the room. Sammy Davis Jr. snapped his fingers. Now that's the finale I signed up for. Then, something extraordinary happened. No producer gave an order. No director made an announcement. Nobody planned it. One by one, people simply started walking. First, Frank Sinatra. Then, Sammy Davis Jr. Then every member of the orchestra, violinists, trumpet players, drummers, pianists, backup singers, stagehands, even the makeup artists. Within seconds, the hallway became filled with people following Elvis and Dean toward the stage. Not because they had been told to, because respect naturally attracts respect. The dressing room slowly emptied. Footsteps echoed farther and farther down the hallway. The young singer remained exactly where she was standing. She looked around. The enormous room that had been full of laughter only moments earlier was now almost completely empty. Only the scattered pages of her script remained on the floor. One page slowly drifted beneath a chair as the air conditioner hummed quietly. She looked toward the hallway. Nobody had asked her to leave. Nobody had insulted her. Nobody had argued. They had simply chosen. For the first time in her rapidly rising career, she understood something fame had never taught her. Talent could attract applause. Character attracted people. The production clock continued counting down. 10 minutes until live broadcast. A nervous assistant director ran through the hallway. "The audience is ready. Cameras are locked. We're live in 10. The executive producer hurried toward Elvis. "What should we tell the audience?" Elvis looked surprised. "The truth." "What truth?" "We're here to raise money." "So let's raise money. No speeches, no drama. Let's just give them the best show we've got." The producer nodded. He finally understood. The argument was over. Not because someone had won, because one man had refused to fight. Backstage, the orchestra quietly tuned one final time. Dean adjusted his tie. Frank Sinatra loosened his shoulders. Sammy Davis Jr. smiled toward Elvis. "You all right?" Elvis looked toward the glowing red stage curtain. Beyond it, more than 20,000 people filled the theater. Millions more waited in front of televisions across America. He smiled. "I've never been better." Just then, the announcer's voice echoed through the building. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are live." In 60 seconds. Beyond the curtain, the audience began applauding. They had no idea that only minutes earlier, the entire finale had nearly disappeared forever. Nor did they know that before the night ended, one unexpected decision would transform what could have been television's greatest disaster into one of Hollywood's most unforgettable moments. The red on-air light illuminated above the studio doors. A floor manager slowly raised his hand. The countdown echoed through every backstage hallway. 10. Every performer took a deep breath. 9. Camera operators adjusted their lenses. 8. The orchestra tightened their grip on their instruments. 7. Millions of television sets flickered to life across America. Families gathered around living room couches. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Hospital patients watched from their beds. Soldiers crowded around televisions inside military bases. Nurses paused in hospital corridors. Restaurant owners turned up the volume. For one evening, an entire nation watched together. 6. Dean Martin looked toward Elvis. "You ready, kid?" Elvis smiled. "I was born ready." 5. Frank Sinatra straightened his tuxedo. Sammy Davis Jr. quietly cracked a joke that made the orchestra laugh. The tension finally eased. 4. The curtain slowly began rising. 3. The audience erupted before anyone had even stepped onto the stage. 2. Spotlights flooded the theater. 1. The music began. The curtain opened completely. Dean Martin walked out first. The applause was enormous. Then Frank Sinatra. Another wave of cheers. Sammy Davis Jr. The audience stood immediately. Finally, Elvis Presley appeared. The theater exploded. People screamed. Women cried. Hundreds of camera flashes illuminated the stage like lightning. The applause became almost deafening. Backstage, the young singer quietly watched from behind the curtain. Nobody looked toward her. Every eye in the theater remained fixed on the performers standing together beneath the lights. The orchestra began the opening arrangement. Elvis stepped toward the microphone. The audience instantly became quiet. He looked across the enormous theater, then smiled. "Good evening." The crowd answered with thunderous applause. He never mentioned what had happened backstage, never hinted at the argument, never tried to explain why someone was missing. Tonight wasn't about wounded pride. It was about the people watching. The music filled the theater. Dean sang the first verse. His warm voice floated effortlessly through the room. Frank followed with unmistakable confidence. Sammy added joy and rhythm that made the audience clap along. Then Elvis stepped forward. His voice carried through every corner of the theater, strong, gentle, effortless. People at home stopped talking. Children stopped moving, even backstage. Technicians quietly paused to listen. The four legends weren't simply singing. They were celebrating one another. Every performer smiled whenever another took the spotlight. Nobody rushed to the center. Nobody tried to outshine anyone else. Every verse became an invitation. Every chorus became a shared victory. Halfway through the performance, something unexpected happened. Dean slowly stepped away from the center microphone. He looked toward Elvis, then quietly gestured with one hand. "Your turn." Elvis shook his head. "No." Dean laughed softly. "Go ahead." Again, Elvis smiled, then pointed toward Frank. Frank stepped forward, finished his verse. Then he pointed toward Sammy. Sammy laughed. "No, I've had enough attention." He pointed back toward Elvis. The audience began smiling. Without saying a word, they were passing the spotlight to one another, not because they had to, because they wanted to. One legendary performer celebrating another. Millions of Americans watched in complete amazement. Backstage, the young singer remained alone. She quietly watched the monitor, her eyes filled with tears. She had expected to see four famous men competing for applause. Instead, she saw four friends helping each other succeed. The realization struck harder than any public criticism ever could. She whispered to herself, "I misunderstood everything." The performance built toward its final chorus. The orchestra swelled, the choir joined in, the audience began singing along. Thousands of voices filled the theater. Some audience members cried openly, others embraced complete strangers. Even veteran television crew members admitted later they had never experienced anything like it. One cameraman quietly wiped away tears while keeping Elvis perfectly in focus. The final note echoed across the theater. Then, silence. For one breathtaking second, nobody moved. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Then, one elderly woman stood. She began applauding. Another person stood beside her, then another. Within moments, every person inside the theater rose to their feet. More than 20,000 people, standing, cheering, applauding. The sound became overwhelming. Flowers landed on the stage. People shouted Elvis's name, Dean's name, Frank's name, Sammy's name. Not because one performer had carried the evening, because, together, they had created something none of them could have created alone. The standing ovation continued. 1 minute, then 2, then 5. Television producers looked at one another. Nobody wanted to cut away. The broadcast schedule no longer mattered. History was happening. Millions of Americans remained glued to their televisions. Backstage, the young singer quietly sat down. She wasn't crying because she had missed the performance. She was crying because she finally understood what greatness really looked like. It wasn't louder, it wasn't brighter, it wasn't standing alone beneath the spotlight. It was standing beside others, without fearing their light. As the applause slowly faded, Dean leaned toward Elvis, quietly enough that only the microphones barely captured it. "Told you we'd make history." Elvis laughed. "No. We made memories," Dean smiled. "Even better." The audience laughed warmly. But backstage, someone was about to make a decision that would stay with them for the rest of their life. The applause still echoed through the theater, even after the orchestra had lowered their instruments, even after the curtain had begun to fall. More than 20,000 people remained standing. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others simply smiled. They knew. They had witnessed something they would tell their children about, not because of one perfect song, not because of one unforgettable voice, but because they had watched 4 legends prove that greatness grows when it is shared. Backstage, the hallway was almost empty. Stagehands quietly rolled equipment toward storage. Lighting technicians disconnected cables. Wardrobe assistants packed costumes into large garment cases. The excitement of the live broadcast slowly faded into peaceful silence. Only one person remained standing exactly where she had been before. The young singer. She stared at the television monitor. The final credits rolled across the screen. Her reflection looked back at her. For the first time in years, she didn't see a superstar. She saw someone whose pride had become louder than her purpose. A production assistant gently walked past. "Everyone's celebrating in the green room." She nodded. "I know. You coming?" She forced a small smile. "In a minute." The assistant quietly disappeared. She looked down. The same performance script she had thrown onto the floor earlier still lay scattered across the carpet. Slowly, she knelt, picked up each page, smoothed every wrinkle with her hands, almost as if she were trying to repair something much bigger than paper. A few minutes later, the dressing room door opened. Laughter filled the hallway. Dean Martin entered first, still smiling. Frank Sinatra followed. Sammy Davis Jr. carried a bouquet someone had thrown onto the stage. Finally, Elvis walked inside. The room became quiet. The young singer immediately stood. She looked at Elvis, then lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Nobody interrupted. She continued, I thought standing beside you would make people overlook me." Her voice trembled. "But tonight, I realized the only person I was trying to compete with was myself." A tear rolled down her cheek. "And I lost." Elvis walked toward her. No anger, no pride, no satisfaction, only kindness. He picked up the folded performance schedule still resting on the table, the same schedule he had quietly folded before walking away. He placed it gently into her hands, then smiled. "You know, when I was younger, I thought every stage belonged to whoever stood in the middle." He paused. "It doesn't." She looked up. "It belongs to everyone willing to give the audience something honest." The room remained silent. Dean Martin smiled quietly from across the room. Frank Sinatra nodded once. Sammy Davis Jr. softly whispered, "That's why he'll always be Elvis." The young singer wiped away her tears. "I don't expect forgiveness." Elvis gently shook his head. "You don't have to earn something. You've already been given." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important question is, what do you become after them?" She slowly nodded. For the first time that evening, she smiled. Not the confident smile she had worn before, a humble one, a real one. Weeks passed. The charity special became one of the most watched broadcasts in television history. Millions of dollars were raised. Hospitals across the country received new equipment. Children received treatments that would have otherwise been impossible. The newspapers celebrated the evening, not because of backstage drama, because of what audiences had seen on stage. Headlines filled the country. A night of unity. 4 legends, 1 purpose. Hollywood's greatest finale. No newspaper mentioned the argument. No reporter revealed the young singer's name. Not because anyone wanted to hide the truth, because the truth wasn't the conflict. The truth was the character that followed it. Years later, during a television interview, the former young singer was asked one question. "What was the biggest mistake of your career?" She smiled sadly. "It wasn't refusing to sing beside Elvis Presley." The interviewer looked surprised. "What was it then?" She answered without hesitation. "For one moment, I believed another person's greatness could make mine smaller." She looked directly into the camera. "It can't. Real greatness doesn't take your light. It teaches you how to shine." Millions watched her answer. Many never knew exactly what she was talking about. Those who had been inside that television studio understood immediately. As for Elvis, he never spoke publicly about that evening, never criticized anyone, never told his version of the story. One afternoon, several years later, a reporter finally asked him, "Mr. Presley, what really happened backstage that night?" Elvis smiled the same quiet smile he always wore. He looked toward the stage where another young performer was rehearsing, then softly replied, "The loudest people are rarely the strongest." He paused, watching the young singer gain confidence with every note, then added, "Respect always sings longer than pride." That sentence traveled farther than any headline. Musicians repeated it, actors remembered it, young performers wrote it inside notebooks they carried to auditions. Because careers can begin with applause. They can grow through talent, but they endure because of character. The audience remembered the songs, the television cameras remembered the performance. Hollywood remembered something else entirely. The moment the biggest star in the room chose humility over ego. The moment another legend reminded everyone that true greatness never fears standing beside greatness. And perhaps that was the greatest performance of all. Not the one beneath the spotlight, but the one behind the curtain. Because applause eventually fades. Fame eventually changes. Records are broken. Stages become empty. But character continues performing long after the music ends.